Hello and welcome to Antinatalism this week. In this video, we'll look at some events that either happened in the last week or are coming up. We'll also look at some of the notable videos published in this week. And then we'll look at one anti-antinatalist article, one paper against antinatalism, and an article by Christopher Belshaw in the Journal of Controversial Ideas, about which even Peter Singer recently tweeted. There was a launch event on the Exploring Antinatalism podcast channel of the new book, Antinatalism, Extinction, and the End of Procreative Self-Corruption by Amanda Suknik and Mati Hairi. Amanda did all the hard work of soliciting different reviews and criticisms. Yes, it features criticisms as well, and then compiling them, editing them, and also enacting some Roman characters. Here we see a drunk Silenus talking about not having children. The video is available on the channel if you want to have a look. I'll of course include the link in the description. Amanda is also starting a new contest for making content related to the book Antinatalism, Extinction, and the End of Procreative Self-Corruption. It could be any kind of content, an essay, an article, a video, a review of the book, or even a song, etc. Submission deadline would be June 15th, and the winners will be announced in the Exploring Antinatalism podcast episode of July the 1st. 3 lucky winners will get a copy of the book signed by its authors Amanda Suknik and Mati Hairi. Nimrod is doing an European tour of antinatalism activism. Here we see him giving a speech in Hamburg. He'll be in Sweden, Malmö on 19th of May, Lund on 20th, and then Gothenburg on 21st and 22nd of May, and then in Stockholm on 23rd and 24th of May before moving to Hungary for the weekend. The second reading group event by Dr. Emile Torres will be on 7th of June, where they'll discuss existential risk, pessimism, and the time of perils by Dr. David Thorstad. The last reading group meeting, which happened on 3rd of May, was not recorded. This time I have asked Dr. Emile to record this as I cannot attend due to mismatching time zones. The good news is he has agreed to record going forward. So let's see. Lawrence has done a series of shorts this week. He did 3 for 3 books, one for Antinatalism, Extinction, and the End of Procreative Self-Corruption by Amanda Suknik and Mati Hairi. Another one on the history of antinatalism by Katrina Lochmanow. And the third one on the recent book by Mara van der Lucht, Getting What Does It Mean to Create a Child. And then he has also done a short for Nimrod's tour and also one short promoting this channel. So thank you very much, Lawrence. A new episode on Anti-Natalism Advocacy podcast was out this week. John Williams, the regular host on the podcast, interviewed Rivka Weinberg. Rivka has been critical of many of Benetta's arguments, and she talks about those in this episode too. She's against the axiological asymmetry. She's also against the quality of life argument. She gives some weight to the consent argument, but eventually says it fails. The only argument she's inclined to consider is the risk argument. But that too only for deciding when procreation is permissible rather than a blanket antinatalist position. She also rejects the misanthropic argument for antinatalism, and then John and Rivka move on to effective altruism, the philosophy of effective altruism, and Rivka criticizes that as well. Talking of John Williams, on a channel called Brother Marcus, John was interviewed on a specific topic. A few days ago, on one of the antinatalism advocacy podcasts with Human Hancock, John had suggested that in some specific scenarios, donating sperm could be compatible with antinatalism. For example, if a couple who would have a child anyway, and if you can donate your sperm to them, then assuming that there is some genetic component in determining the qualities like compassion, and assuming that you have those so-called good genes, then you might as well donate your sperm to them. There are many caveats to this, and this suggestion did cause a bit of a controversy back then. John appeared on this channel this week to clarify some of his arguments in this area. Last week, I had asked if someone could help me get access to the Medium article when misanthropes claim the moral high ground, and many people helped me to get that access. So thank you to all of you for this generous help. Generally, I don't cover Medium articles or personal blogs or Reddit posts, but sometimes I do, and this is one of those exceptions. This article has got more than 500 reactions, which in my observation is a good level of engagement for something published on Medium. It is written by Benjamin Kane, who claims to have PhD in philosophy and has written about 5 books on various philosophical topics. The title of the article has the word misanthropes in it. Benjamin does not care to clarify what exactly he means by that term. A cursory look at any dictionary tells us that misanthrope is someone who dislikes humankind or avoids humans. But Benjamin here uses the term loosely to refer to anyone who is against continuation of life. And another term is moral high ground. This is not too dissimilar to the way vegans are accused to be occupying moral high ground. But Benjamin's argument has a slightly different shade to it. The argument is if antinatalists take a moral high ground over the rest of the society, then they should also have to recognize the personhood of others. which means others have freedom to think in their own way. Benjamin says the higher level on which minds and societies operate has some freedom to improve, to reduce collective suffering, contrary to the antinatalists' pessimism. The question is, how is this contrary to antinatalists' pessimism? Antinatalists are not against improving the lives of existing people or reducing suffering of existing people. Anyway, the argument further says that if we don't recognize this personhood and reduce people to organisms dictated by biological, chemical, and physical forces, then why should suffering matter? Would it not lead to nihilism? Benjamin says, are we up in arms when the sun casts a shadow or when the wind blows a leaf off a tree? No. So why should we rail against the continuation of suffering in society if people are nothing but vessels for the replication of DNA with no moral standing? There are two problems in this argument. One is a false dichotomy that either a being is a morally relevant being or it is just a chemical machine and deserves no moral consideration. The article does not even make a distinction between moral patients, which are those beings who are not capable of making moral decisions but are still morally relevant, and moral agents, which are those who can make such decisions. Usually, antinatalist philosophers agree that mentally healthy adult humans are moral agents. Therefore, we ought to have other considerations like autonomy and right to procreate, etc. for them. To what extent other beings have moral agency is debatable. But we can agree that they are sentient beings, that is, those who have capacity to suffer and therefore are at least moral patients. Second problem is the assumption that suffering of only moral agents matter. It is not clear why this arbitrary boundary is drawn. There are some false associations too. For example, Benjamin says, if death were bad, so would be the ending of all life by a voluntary refusal to replenish species with new generations via sexual reproduction. The ambiguity here is taking badness of death of an individual and applying it on the species level. This confusion between death of an individual and the extinction of a species is quite a common misunderstanding. Benjamin further says, instead of holding out the possibility of an overall fulfilling purpose, one that could justify suffering, this misanthrope adopts a simplistic anti-humanistic kind of naturalism. But it is not clear what this goal is, neither does Benjamin care to clarify. So overall, this article sounded like an emotional criticism, albeit using some hoity-toity words. Juna Räsänen had published a paper, Should Vegans Have Children?, examining the links between animal ethics and antinatalism. This is an old paper. Lewis Austin Ames has published a paper this week, Should Vegans Have Children? A response to Räsänen. Räsänen had provided two arguments, one based in utilitarianism and another one based on rights. And in both cases, he had drawn parallels between the arguments for veganism and arguments for antinatalism and concluded that vegans ought to be antinatalist, they ought not to have children. On the utilitarian argument, Lewis presents Räsänen's original argument, which was a comparison of veganism and antinatalism. Now, veganism is opposition to many forms of animal use, but Räsänen had taken factory farming as a representative aspect for veganism, and he compared two things. On the one hand, we have suffering and interest frustration of factory farmed animals. On the other hand, we have suffering and interest frustration of humans as a result of abstaining from consuming meat and dairy products of those animals. And because the suffering of animals outweighs the suffering of humans in this case, that is, the disutility to factory farmed animals is greater than the disutility to humans who are abstaining from consuming their products, factory farming becomes immoral. Similarly, in the case of having children, since the suffering experienced by children in their lives will be greater than the suffering experienced by people because of abstaining from having those children, that is, the disutility to children is greater than the disutility to prospective parents from abstaining from having those children. Having children is immoral. Lewis's contention is on drawing this analogy from veganism to antinatalism. Lewis explains briefly the suffering that factory farmed animals go through. He also considers other arguments against veganism, like more animals are killed in plant farming due to the practices like plowing, etc., or that vegan diets are not healthy and so on, but he rejects them either on the logical grounds or for the lack of proper evidence. Lewis presents a case that children whose lives would be worth living, in the case of such children, their suffering is not comparable to the suffering of factory farmed animals. Räsänen had addressed this problem on the lines similar to those by David Benatar to show that even the best lives have serious suffering and there are chronic long-term pains but only short-term pleasures. To counter this, Lewis gives examples of some long-lived pleasures. That includes the satisfaction of having a fulfilling career or the contentment from knowing that one's loved ones are safe, or deep relationships and enjoyable hobbies. And he also gives some examples of short-term pains like suffering from cold or daily minor inconveniences. Lewis says that even if there is a lot of suffering in human life, it can still be characterized by well-being rather than suffering. Talking about the quality of life argument, he says, even though people might be biased towards positive outcomes in their lives, it does not skew the reality enough to conclude that human lives are characterized by suffering rather than well-being. He also considers prospective parents and says that the real question is whether by abstaining from having children, prospective parents would experience more or less well-being or suffering than if they were to have children. Lewis says that of vegans who want to have children, it would be a great disutility to them if they abstain from having them. To summarize, he says that coming into existence whose lives are worth living is a net utility for those who are coming into existence and also a net utility for their parents. Now, I don't know how Juna Räsänen will respond to this argument. We will see if it does, but for now, I am going to provide my own opinion on this. It is not entirely clear here by utilitarian argument do we mean by maximizing utility, which is the traditional view, or minimizing the disutility, which is more of a negative utilitarian view. Secondly, the term factory farming is immoral is ambiguous. A superficial view is that factory farming is immoral because animals suffer in those places. But more importantly, it is immoral because it is immoral to bring animals into existence in those places. If we compare them being into existence to when they were not, then it is easy to see the disutility, which is far greater than the disutility to humans who are abstaining from eating them for the purposes of taste and pleasure. And that is why veganism is opposed not just to factory farming, but also to the meat coming from happy animals. Vegans understand that such happy animals would not have come into existence if it were not for the meat industry. One could make a utilitarian case where the total well-being of that happy animal plus the total well-being of the eater of that animal is greater than the total disutility to the animal plus the total disutility to humans from abstaining from eating that animal. But given that vegans would still not eat that meat is an evidence that minimizing disutility is more important for them than maximizing utility. Similar is the case for children. The variations in the degree of suffering does not matter as long as there is some serious suffering in their lives. The disutility due to that suffering to those children, given that they would not have any such disutility before coming into existence, is going to be greater than the disutility to prospective parents due to lack of children. And so, even if the total utility of happy life to those children plus the total utility to parents from having them might be greater than the disutility otherwise. If minimizing the disutility is important than maximizing the utility for vegans, as we already saw, then having children is still immoral. But you might say that many vegans are opposed to consuming meat due to rights-based arguments. So now let's have a look at the rights-based argument. Here, Räsänen uses the analogy that animals are brought into existence as a mere means to satisfy the desires of meat and dairy eaters. Similarly, children are brought into existence as a mere means to satisfy the desires of their parents. And if one is wrong, then another one would also be wrong. Lewis contends that children are brought into existence as a mere means, but agrees that animals are brought into existence as a mere means, at least in factory farms. He considers the fact that farmers give some consideration to the well-being of farmed animals. For example, they stun them before slaughtering them. But he says that all of that is ultimately to get their meat, whereas parents are genuinely concerned with the welfare of their children. So much so that parents are ready to do great sacrifices for their children. If they know that their child is going to suffer a lot, they are also ready to give up their desire of having children. But one might argue that they desire to have healthy children in the first place. But Lewis rejects this, saying that majority of parents would refrain from having them if they knew beforehand that their child would suffer. Now here is my take on this argument. I am not convinced that children are not used as mere means. Farmers love their cattle is an argument you hear quite often. Farmers take care of their animals. Welfarists want their animals to be healthy. And if we keep factory farming aside for a moment, many farmers are genuinely concerned for the welfare of their animals. But all of that concern is ultimately to extract something from those animals. Let's take another example. Most vegans are also opposed to breeding of pets, even though great care is taken of them. So taking care or being concerned about the welfare of a being does not automatically nullify the possibility of them being used as mere means. In case of children, it is even more pronounced because children satisfy the need that we have to take care of somebody else. I'm also not convinced that parents sacrifice their desires of having children if they knew beforehand that that child is going to suffer a lot in their life. The primary reason is parents want a healthy child in the first place and abandon having a suffering child in their own interests. Lewis also makes an argument against avoidance of unnecessary suffering. He says that vegans are not opposed to unnecessary suffering as a general rule. He provides some examples for this. He says that lowering the speed limit of vehicles on the road would reduce the risk of suffering, but that will be at the cost of some inconveniences. Like travel would be slower and you would spend less time with family and so on. Another example is at least some bars, pubs, cinemas and restaurants are unnecessary, in that their absence would not cause a huge loss. But while building them, some suffering is definitely involved. Lewis says that vegans are not opposed to these kinds of things, so unnecessary suffering is not a problem. My take on this argument is I am not convinced if these examples are right. For those who already exist, we have to make trade-offs between suffering and pleasures or comforts. But that is not the case for those who don't yet exist. So the suffering that results from creating them could have been avoided with no trade-offs for them. If you argue that the trade-off is between creating their suffering and reducing the suffering of existing people, both in the case of farmed animals and children, then it is easy to see, at least on the rights-based argument, why vegans would oppose such a trade-off. Finally, I just want to point out an important similarity between veganism and antinatalism. This is not an argument both in the original Räsänen's paper and Lewison's response. Vegans very well know that farmed animals would not have existed if it were not for the meat and dairy industry. They accept this consequence to be better than in the case where these animals are brought into existence. That means vegans accept that absence of pain is good even if there is nobody who would enjoy that good. Whereas absent pleasures are not bad unless there is somebody who is deprived of those absent pleasures. These are premises of Bennett's axiological asymmetry. Moreover, vegans are also against discriminating between species for the aspects that are morally relevant. Combining these two things, vegans having children becomes ethically problematic. Peter Singer recently tweeted an article by Christopher Belshaw in the Journal of Controversial Ideas. The article was titled Antinatalism and the Asymmetry. The antinatalism in the title with capital A and capital N is Bennett's antinatalism, and the asymmetry is of Jeff McMahon. Let's have a look at the asymmetry first. Imagine two potential lives. In one life, there are going to be more bads than goods, and so we have a reason to not start such a life. In another life, there are going to be more goods than bads. Here, starting a new life may not be required, but could be permitted. When we talk about the reasons to start or not to start those lives, we are not thinking of reasons for existing people. For example, we can create a life to contribute to the society or for increasing the population and so on. But we are not considering those reasons. We are considering the reasons for the sake of the person who will be created. Belshaw's main objection is about starting good lives, where we say that it is not required but may be permitted. Just to clarify here, bad lives could mean lives worth not living, miserable lives, or just overall bad lives. On the other hand, good lives could mean lives worth living, happy lives, or overall good lives. Belshaw considers three possibilities while starting a good life. 1. We have a reason to start such a good life. 2. Starting a good life is not required but permitted. And 3. Starting even a good life is forbidden. Let's have a look at each of those views. On the view that we have a reason to start a good life, Belshaw considers this and calls this as total view and rejects it, saying that this is a minority view. Belshaw spends most of the time on the view that starting a good life is not required but permitted. He points out the contradiction between not required and permitted. Now, this is counterintuitive, so Belshaw explains further. Life contains some bads and some goods, and bads provide us a reason to not start that life. Remember, that is why we have a reason to not start bad lives. So it is clear that bads provide us a reason against starting lives. But if we are saying starting a good life is not required, then that means goods in life don't provide us reasons enough. So what functions do these goods perform here? One possibility could be that they cancel bads in life. But that does not seem to be the case, because presence of goods on its own does not eliminate bads in life. Bads still remain in the life. So Belshaw proposes that goods actually just compensate for bads. He says that bads in your life can't be removed, but there is available some good to soften the blow, or as a form of payback or return for your suffering the bad. This calculation of compensation between goods and bads only works if there is a person who has some future desires. Belshaw says that only people or persons, I want to say, can be properly compensated for their pains. But non-human animals, for example, don't have this sense of future. So the compensation calculus does not work for them. And so for animals, he says, better for them never to have been, and given there are further pains ahead, better that they cease to be. Similarly, babies and neonates also don't have this sense of future. And for them, he says, we should not be speciesist. There is no relevant difference here between typical animals and those babies and neonates who, because of death, damage or disease, will never develop into persons. And therefore, we should not start the lives of these babies, and if started, then we should end them. And this is even when good parts outweigh and outnumber the bad. If you think this is controversial, then be reminded that we are looking at an article in the Journal of Controversial Ideas. Now these babies can further develop into person, and then they can have a sense of future. And then the compensation of goods against bads can kick in. But until such a point is reached, the bads in their life are a reason to not start their life, and if started, to end it. So we started with a not required clause and ended in contradiction to permitted. And therefore, Belshaw says that starting good lives is also forbidden. Belshaw explains that this reasoning is different than that of Bennett's. He says that suppose a person with a sense of compensation could be created instantly, then the bad in his life would be compensated by the goods in his life, but starting such a life would still not be permissible on Bennett's view. But it would be in the case of Belshaw's view. Belshaw's trouble is only due to that middle phase of human lives and all phases of non-human lives where pains or bads exist without the sense of compensation. These uncompensated pains provide us both antinatalist and pro-mortalist reasons. Belshaw considers some objections. One is that non-human animals do have a sense of future. He says, although this is doubtful, not all animals are equal. So the pro-mortalist part of the argument would work only for those animals who truly lack the sense of future. But the antinatalist part would still work. Another objection is, if presence of desires is so important, then what about the person in coma? That person would still have desires, but that person is in coma. Belshaw qualifies the presence of desires clause here, and he says that death is not bad only when the desires are permanently gone or have not developed in the first place. If there is a chance that that person in coma may come back, the loss of desires was only temporary. And if it is sure that the person will never come back, then the desires are lost permanently, and then death is not bad for him. He also considers the objection of potentiality. For example, a baby might not be a person right now, but will acquire personhood and desires and a sense of compensation in future. So the uncompensated pains right now could be compensated in future. Belshaw says this can only be thought of retrospectively once personhood is achieved. But at present, the baby has no interest in future and so provides no reason to start such a life. He also explains his differences with Bennett's. Bennett's had proposed that starting a new life is not permitted, but once it is started, it is not okay to end it as well. Bennett's reasons for this are conscious interests in sentient beings. They may not be self-conscious in the case of babies and non-humans, but they do have an interest in continuing their lives. Whereas Belshaw thinks that it is desires than interests that matter more. And in absence of such desires, all pains are uncompensated by goods. And because there is always a phase like this, it is not permitted to start a new life. Belshaw finally concludes that there could be other regarding reasons, that is, reasons involving other people's desires to start a new life, and so there could still be reasons to have children nonetheless.